Tomorrow at the Crescent Arts Centre at 7:30, the Manitoba Chamber Orchestra is inviting audience members to take short sojourns in various places around the world. Places such as New York, Paris, the Netherlands, India, Brazil, and even North Battleford, Saskatchewan. Your companion during these sojourns will be the 4-time Juno Award winning composer and Renaissance man, David Braid. As a musician, David Braid has traveled the world absorbing musical languages and sounds from ethnicities from various regions of the planet. These travels and experiences help form the basis of tomorrow night's concert. Joining Braid and the musicians of the Manitoba Chamber Orchestra on stage will be the outstanding Canadian violinist Mark Fewer. Currently on faculty at the University of Toronto, Fewer is also a Juno winner. He has performed as soloist with the Vancouver, Toronto, and Edmonton Symphony Orchestras and performed for a few years with the renowned St. Lawrence String Quartet. Called Intrepid, Mark Fewer is also a champion of contemporary music, having premiered over 200 works, with more than 50 of these compositions being written specifically for him. And joining me here in the Classic 107 studio to talk about David Braid's Concerto, I am joined by Mark Fewer and composer David Braid. Hello to you both. So great to have you here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So I first want to ask, you're both here in Winnipeg. The show's tomorrow. When did you arrive here in town and you beat the storm?
Yesterday afternoon I got here and it was just raining. It was a little bumpy on the way over, but mostly okay. Was it all right?
I get in a little later, but we've managed to avoid the bad weather getting here.
Well, it's supposed to be coming later today, so
is that right?
Yeah, break out the boots.
Yeah.
David, I want to first talk about your double concerto. It's called the Joya Concerto. Is that right?
Yeah, that's one title. It could also be called Concerto Number 1 because it's the first one, and it's subtitled Joya, which might be the official title, but. Both are good.
Is it named for Joya Hoy? And if so, who is she and why is she so important to you?
Sure. The title references two things. The first is one of the first ensembles to inspire me to consider how non-European art music can integrate with European art music was this great quartet from the Netherlands, which Mark and I both know. They were called ZAP. And the sort of genius in that group is this guy, Una Van Geel, or Van Geel, if you read it with English pronunciation. And I was playing a concert with them in the Netherlands. And these guys were they were just on this particular night. It was electrifying, and they finished the set. And it was this one piece that used this particular pentatonic scale that I hadn't heard before, and oddly enough. And they came backstage and he said, joy, joy, joy. And that's something to do with the color of the harmony and the feeling of the concert. They just planted some sort of energy in me that found its way out years later when I was playing a solo concert in Saskatchewan, in Saskatoon. And then this very interesting woman found who introduced herself as Joya Hoy, I believe. And she said, I have a house concert series in North Battleford. You're in town. If you have a night off, why don't you come out? And I love playing house concerts. I love the intimacy of that. And so she came and picked me up in my hotel in Saskatoon and drove me out and basically told me this really interesting musical story where there was a famous piano teacher, I think from Vienna, who moved. Some people might know about this and know who I'm talking about. I can't remember his name. Who moved out there in the 40s, I think, and started this culture of very this piano school basically. And there were this community of prairie children who were studying with this great Viennese pianist, and she was one of them, and she was excelling. And I think at a young age, maybe mid-teens, she went to study at some school in Vienna, and then she came back with sort of like a concert career in front of her, and I think she got involved with a kind of cult or something, and she, as she was explaining to me, and moved to the U.S. and lived most of her life in this particular community. I don't mean cult in necessarily a bad way, but just sort of a closed society that had some sort of affiliation, I believe, with Hinduism. And then she came back, sort of in the beginning of the autumn of her life, back to North Battleford. And And she was just telling me, what it was like to awaken from, having lived decades away from society, having also this really interesting musical gift from this musical culture. And she referenced other people of her generation. This, I think, was the main point that really touched me. There was a community of women her age in the prairies who were very talented and very well musically educated due to this one Viennese teacher. Mm-hmm. But because of culture at the time in the 1950s, they couldn't develop themselves. It was more like, okay, family, stay on the farm, you can't pursue this. And I remember that feeling of that tragedy really touched me because, some great musicians didn't have the opportunity to evolve and perhaps the way they should. In her case, it was sort of an extreme, unusual thing, but for the rest of the community, it was because culture at the time didn't really make it permissible. And so then I spent a lovely few hours at her place. I did this house concert, and I remember there was all this beautiful Hindu art in her home. In addition to her father, who was a doctor in the area, collected soapstone sculptures, I believe. And so her home was like a museum, and I think at the time I was composing the theme to this, a melody, which actually became the theme to this concerto, which used this pentatonic scale from this experience of remembering these Dutch guys saying joy, 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 and using this pentatonic scale, which had a sort of it came from Indian classical music because the violist from this Dutch quartet had studied there. And then meeting Joya Hoy and thinking about her story and seeing this artwork, and somehow all of that information came together to form the melody that became the theme to this concerto. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the North Battleford connection, sort of.
Yeah, as we were talking off air, I lived in North Battleford growing up as a kid for 5 years, and I loved it. I have very fond memories of North Battleford, Saskatchewan. A lot of great musicians have come out of there. What was your impression?
Well, it was very brief. I mean, I drove in with her, and then I was at the house, and then I played the concert, and then she drove me back after the concert. So I didn't really get a chance at all to see anything except through the window of the car, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a wonderful little town. Mark, can you talk about the collaborative process that you and David had when it came to this concerto? What were some of the things that were discussed by the two of you during the composition process?
Interestingly, when this idea came about, it was really the result of having had so many years behind us collaboratively. And so ultimately, I think at a certain point, I would say pretty much every classical musician in Canada was knocking on David's door to write them something. And it was just through the good grace of the fact that we had a performing relationship for quite some time. In fact, I don't even really remember when we first...
Yeah, I was thinking about that yesterday.
You just talked about the Zapp Quartet from Amsterdam. That's so long ago now in my mind. So it seems like we've known each other forever. But basically what that really amounts to answer your question, is there's a real ease in the relationship. And so... I never felt at any point when we started down this path that I was either going to be asked to do something that I knew I couldn't do, or not feeling satisfied with anything. Because sometimes you like somebody's music, you say, oh, wouldn't it be great if they write me something? And your ego gets involved, and I feel like we're on a pretty easy path here, in the sense that I really appreciate David as a writer and as an artist, and he knows me well enough to know what I can or can't bring to the table, because there's stuff I can't do.
Nonsense.
No, but to be honest, like, that means that ultimately, while this right now has our fingerprints on it, it will have a life after us, I do believe, and it will have a different spin when we're gone. Sure. And I think that's really a great thing. So it does depend on David and I to really kind of bring it out in its current form. But I didn't want it to just be about us. I wanted it to be something that would showcase our relationship, but then have enough in it that it could have a future. And I really believe that's where it's at right now. Because there actually have been several revised versions of this. And when we finally sat down to record it, we recorded it with an orchestra in Prague about 1.5 years ago. We sat down to record it. Then it really felt like, okay, now it's kind of done. But even after that, you sent me another revised version. But I think, like, I just think for me, I've had a very lucky and blessed life and people wanting to write me pieces of music over the years. And there's only a handful of people I could really say really understand me as an artist. They might listen to me and say, oh, wow, he really plays the violin well. I love him to play this piece and I'll write him this piece. But because we've known each other for so long and played together on stage in battle, speaking of North Battleford, in battle sequences, because we have that relationship, this whole process has been nothing but a joy. Oh, that was horrible. Dad jokes, boy. Can you tell we're getting old?
Yeah. Can you talk about the structure of the piece? I mean, I saw the little video that's on YouTube where you say it comes from musical minds of India, Netherlands, Brazil, etc. Can you talk about the structure of the piece, both of you? And I sort of also want to take the approach, how does he incorporate some of these sounds in the violin writing and the piano part? And David, maybe I'll start with you.
So the structure, believe it or not, comes from a Christopher Nolan film that I watched like on a plane somewhere. And do you remember the film called The Prestige about these two magicians?
Yeah.
And there's this great, I think it's in the opening, it's certainly in the opening scenes of the film, and it's some actor that they just have this quote that whatever they say, you just believe them, so like Michael Caine or something. And they're describing the structure, the form of a magic trick. And it says 3 parts to it. There's the, what is it now? The, starts with the P. The what's it called? The, okay, it's not premise, but let's just say I'm going to use the word premise.
Yeah.
And then the second is called the turn. And then the third is called the prestige.
Okay.
And I thought that's a really interesting idea to bring into a musical form. So in the premise, and the word isn't premise, I can't believe I'm blanking on it, but it's naturally the exposition.
Right.
Okay. And now I think it's the pitch, but it's not the pitch either. But the main thing is psychologically it's interesting. You present something, like in a magic trick, it's a dove, and people know, okay, I know what that is. Is it called the promise? No, it's not the promise. A white dove, I know what it is. I know what I should expect in terms of its behavior. It's not going to turn pink. It's not going to turn into a banana. So it's, I have expectations about this. So in the piece, the exposition is the same thing. I have this long theme, which I take quite a long time to deliver to the audience to make sure that they've learned the theme to the exposition, because it's as important as setting up the premise in this 3 parts of the magic trick.
Right.
The second part, the term in magic is called the turn, where you turn the expectation. Okay, so naturally in a musical form, there's a turn. The answer to the exposition would naturally be something that would be comparable to that. So now we're talking about an A-B form. But the cool part here is the prestige, which in magic is when you make the dove disappear, but then the prestige is you make it come back. And what I did in the musical piece, in the third part, rather than typically restate the theme, which is the typical form, ABA.
Yep.
This case, I made the prestige, which means this long A melody and this shorter B melody, which you think have nothing to do with each other, actually fit together in the prestige to form this beautiful polyphony that's really unexpected.
Right.
So that 3-part form, so A, B, and then A, B combined, was the result of just thinking how to apply that interesting form that's used in magic into a musical context.
And you said long melody. You and I have talked about this before. You visited Azerbaijan and Turkey and those kinds of places, and Armenia. And last time I saw you, we were talking about how Armenian music has these long lines. Are the melodies like that in the A section?
In terms of length?
Yeah.
Oh, they're very long. I mean, ultimately, a lot of music tends to be within our breathing capacity, right?
Right.
Whether it's instrumental or it's a vocal piece, it'll be a line that a composer will write that will exist for as long as you can keep your breath going, and then you have to take a breath.
Right.
I actually was looking into this recently because of the work by George Enesco, the String Octet, and I think in the classical music world, it has the longest phrase ever written,
is that right?
which is about 56 seconds long before you take a breath. Right?
Wow.
So it's not quite as long here with Joya variations, but these are long lines. And for me, this idea of the turn is the most intriguing, because because I know the piece and I know how the prestige works, I'm expecting it, and I think when people get exposed to that, it is pretty magical. But for me, the turn is how how I love to relate to a lot of music, which is I'm inside a zone of exploration, some type of expression, and then without it naturally just doing its expected or going into its expected zone or outcome, it changes and it does something unexpected. And David's a master of that in terms of deviating. So, there's actually a couple of spots in this piece where I think anybody who's sitting there listening will go, how the hell did we get here? There's one spot in particular where you jump into the piano.
Oh, that
there, yeah. You like that. I'm sure people will be sitting there going, I don't know how it is we got here, but this is incredible. So it's that kind of manipulation of some of the basic elements of what we consider to be form that I really appreciate about this piece.
On the Manitoba Chamber Orchestra's website, they say that the piece is inspired by jazz and some Indian music and the rest of it. How does that make its way into the music? I mean, when I think of Indian music, the first thing obviously that pops in my mind is raga, raga rhythms.
Right.
Is there any of that in the concerto?
There's no Carnatic stuff, is there? There's no Carnatic stuff with the hand gestures and the rests and the breathing. No. Okay. So then no.
Think in those
that would be no.
So, but are there scales that aren't necessarily diatonic that are used, David?
Yeah.
Or are you using modes? Or
Well, I think, because now we're in that touchy subject of borrowing from other cultures. So I think it's appropriate that I should say how I approach extracting. And I think it's an important discussion to have, especially these days where we want to do the right thing. At the same time, we want to be inspired by new materials, so I had this experience in Uzbekistan where I was I just done a master class on improvisation with a sort of jazz spin on it at the Uzbek State Conservatory, and it was packed. People were really interested to find out about this musical language, and I, with the same musical curiosity back at Uzbek folk music, they decided to bring in their heavyweight improviser to the end of the master class. And he didn't speak any English, and it was him playing a sort of a single-stringed instrument, I believe, and with a sort of percussion instrument. And they basically just said, just listen and you'll catch it. And it's okay, it's in 5 beats. It's a cycle of 5 beats. I got that, slow. And it was built on a scale which the closest approximation using the piano, you could describe it as an Aeolian mode. So based
natural
on
minor
that
scale.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And based on that, I could figure out what the tonic was based on what. So of course I can sort of jam along, And the students thought this is the greatest. How is it possible that this Canadian guy can sit in? But really, what we're talking about here, there's a musical common language.
Right.
The idea of tonic is universal. Yeah. Mode is universal. Rhythm is universal. And I was thinking maybe a way to, I can, feel comfortable where to extract and where not to extract is this idea. I started thinking about musical culture as sort of coin. And on one side of the coin is the common language. Yeah. The other side of the coin is what the common language does for the culture. It speaks their stories. It shares their story. And that's none of my business. That's something to do with being Uzbek, But I'm not projecting another culture's story. I'm just, if they organize their pitch system this way and this moves me, I think that's something about our shared humanity which has value, So with the Joya Concerto, it's basically a collection of musical materials that fall within the common language, which move me, And I think possibly because my musical upbringing occurred outside of a conservatory model or a typical model, and maybe because my background is jazz and which is, diverse in its influences, that maybe just my ears were a bit more sensitive when I'm traveling around to pick up, there's a rhythm here that catches my attention, it fascinates me, there's a melody here, and so on. And I think that's a beautiful way going forward into the future to build new music.
Yeah, absolutely. You come from a jazz background, but Mark, you played jazz as well. Was this something that the two of you bonded over
originally? Again, coming back to how the heck we met all those years ago, I don't really remember that.
It didn't make us enemies.
That's for sure. That's for sure. No, I think, if I'm not mistaken, we would have first met when we played the piece about the caves in France. Right. And you had not heard me play before, and I had not heard you play before, and we were in the room together, in our first rehearsal for this work, and both kind of looking at each other going, wait a second.
My man.
Right? I know this guy. And I think that's how we first met. I don't remember where that was, but I remember it was that piece. But yes, my jazz upbringing was actually on saxophone, not on violin.
I never knew that.
Yeah, it was in Newfoundland where they had a really robust public school system for music.
They still do.
Less so, but yes, yeah. But so I had a saxophone in my hands, and when I was 10 years old, I had already been playing violin since I was 6. And saxophone really became a vehicle for learning jazz, and then I just started to try and transfer it over to violin in my teens. Although I would say, to be honest, I'm still transferring it over because I hope saxophonists who are listening to this won't get upset when I say this because I do play the instrument still. But on saxophone, you basically have one fingering for everything, and on violin, there's no end of possibilities with those things. So it's a process I'm still in. But also, I feel like, and David's been a big influence on me in this way, as have a couple other people like Phil Dwyer and Dan Jank and other people, that in terms of my own life as an improviser, even though the straight-ahead jazz world was kind of where I started, that's not where a lot of my focus remains. I'll still do that, and I really will enjoy doing that. In fact, last month I had a fun show doing some old Chick Corea tunes. It was really fun to do that stuff. But now it'll be more in a world where, like with David, we have other elements to play with rather than strict jazz harmony rules. So, and I think that's the future too. I think there's a lot of people involved in a lot of musical pursuits that are looking for collaborative ways that have structures and have forms, but maybe the language inside those structures and forms is allowing itself
it's sort
to
of
be.
one of the premises of the Sojourn concert. I mean, you look at the program, Jesse Montgomery, this Steve Reich. Steve Reich is a big jazz lover, and even in the Joya Concerto, my understanding is there's jazz elements in that as well.
Yeah,
I guess it's worth mentioning too. I mean, some of the cadenzas are improvised, which of course is coming out of the jazz spirit, and how amazing is it that Mark, in addition to being incredibly versatile, playing all sorts of music from any generation or corner of the classical music world, is a great improviser. So that, like, in some of the piece, it's like I think I just deliver a mode. And
you say, here, start with this.
And I love how that captures the beauty of what can happen spontaneously in a concert, and how we can make that a musical value, and it also makes every performance unique.
Totally.
And also every soloist, they can really have an opportunity to say something personal, which isn't for everyone, but with the few extraordinarily amazing people like Mark, they can now have this extra thing that they can do that makes it so their own. And I think since uniqueness has such a high value, I really like how this concerto can capitalize on that.
Yeah,
I'd say one other thing about the whole melange of ingredients, maybe 15 years ago or so, I was in India and I was playing in Bangalore with a tabla player, and we were asked to basically come up with something, right? And I was very much the learner in this environment, and he was showing me some form that we were going to start to play with, and some rhythms that we were going to start to play with, and then a series of notes that we would start to play with. And it was really just his ability to have a wide open mind and allow me into the space that made this really pretty outstanding performance occur, I have to say, not to pat myself on the back, but it was this really beautiful exploration of what was possible. And I feel like maybe this is one of the great things that Manitoba Chamber Orchestra is doing so well, because they have such great programming all year round. I was looking at their website, and I know we were talking about this before going on air. They have the best programming in this country for that size of an ensemble. It's outstanding.
Yeah, it really is.
But it means that they have created a space, much like this guy in India. They've created a space where people come to the event with wide open ears and minds, and okay, let's do this. Let's explore something together and see what we find, and let's be okay with whatever we find. I've actually witnessed David doing classes in improvisation, and one of the phrases he says to students once in a while is, if you have an idea that you'd really like to bring out, I don't want you to betray that instinct at any moment. 'Cause, I know I've given you some ideas to play with here, but if you're in the middle of your solo and you feel like you're going to break out into something else, and that's genuinely what you want to do, I don't want you to think, no, I shouldn't do that. I think that's a really beautiful thing about where we're at right now in the music world, and where many of the musical collaborations that we find ourselves part of, that's where the conversation begins. And I love that about this.
Yeah, and a lot of it is going to be heard in the Joya Concerto.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. It just sounds like an amazing, amazing piece. Mark and David, this has just been so great having you back here in studio.
Always a pleasure.
I'm going to wrap up the conversation by asking, what are you both looking forward to about tomorrow night's performance?
Who first?
Well, I have a lot of friends here in Winnipeg, and people I don't see often enough, to be honest. Mm-hmm. I really enjoy the people I know in this town. And I think because I'm a fiddle player, I'll just single out right away. You know, there's been a history here of two really great people. It's Gwen Hobig and Carl Stobie, who just there's no other place in the country that has two fiddle players in the roles that they have in a community like this, that have created a community for everyone to enjoy without being at each other's throats, right? That's usually the way it is with fiddle players. But they're extraordinary, and I love them both, and I'm really looking forward to seeing both of them, because I will see both of them while I'm here. And there are people here that I really do enjoy, and I don't see often enough. So I'm looking forward to that. And I know a lot of them are going to be at the concert tomorrow night, and a lot of them know David and his work, and they're really excited to hear this piece. Mm-hmm. So for me, I'm really excited to have them experience this.
Mm-hmm. David, how about you?
Well, there's a few different ways I could answer, but I'll choose the one that's the most embarrassing, because the first time I tried to take a stab at the musical language that I use now was actually in Winnipeg 20 years ago, and it was a disaster. Like one of my superpowers is, like, if there's a mistake to be made, I'm gonna make
find it.
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, that's how I learned how to write. By making every possible mistake, and I managed to do that with my first sort of crossover piece. The Winnipeg Symphony played it, and it was like completely my fault. It was a disaster, And that, oddly enough, was 19 years ago. So in a funny way, I'm now thinking about that experience and just the idea of recognizing something that you believe in, and even though it's failing, is sort of realizing that these failures actually aren't failures unless you quit. It's sort of an indication of the right thing to do, but in the negative form, Mm-hmm. So 19 years later, I'm coming back now with, sort of I felt extremely touched to have, Mark at my side and sort of open. I met the conductor in the hotel just now, and she seems to know my work, and the players seem to be sort of open-armed. It's sort of really beautiful, touching thing for me to have a couple decades pass and, through a lot of mistakes, eventually come to something that people seem to be excited to play about. So in a sort of personal way, I sort of feel like I'm crossing a...
It doesn't surprise me that open arms come from the musicians of the Manitoba Chamber Orchestra.
Nice.
It's a fabulous group. Mark and David, this has been so great to have you back here in studio. All the best tomorrow night. I'm sure it's going to be just outstanding. Thanks for taking the time to stop by our Classic 107 studio and talk to me today. For our Classic 107 listeners, Sojourn with the Manitoba Chamber Orchestra, David Braid and Mark Fewer, takes place tomorrow night at the Crescent Arts Centre at 7:30. For more details, go to themco.ca, or you can go to classic107.com. I've embedded a direct link to the show page where you can find out more details and about how to get tickets. Mark and David, thanks again.
Thank you.